Okay. Hello, everybody. So in the era of Zoom, something really weird just happened to me is that my kids, they go on to Zoom on my account and they knock me off. So that was a
Mm.
new one for me tonight. And I'm going to have to text. I'm actually at Chabad now in my recording studio. So if it happens again, I really apologize. Um, I never anticipated that being an issue. So that is a really new one for me.
What happened? I lost you.
Yeah, I got knocked off of Zoom.
Oh, okay. I thought it was my internet again.
All right, we're learning every week. I really apologize, everybody. If it happens again, I'm doing my best.
Too.
All right, this is really a new world. All right, so you can hear me now.
Yes.
Yes.
We're invigorated. So the animal soul, it actually isn't called the animal soul in chapter 1. Later on, it refers to this other soul, the animal soul. It calls the animal soul. It actually calls it the human soul because it's human. It's not like animals, not like, oh, it's this like animal. You got this piece of it's a human normal function that you have this.
I'm right here. See me.
Mute everybody real quickly. Just one sec. And all right, I'm back. So the human function is very similar to an animal's in the sense of self-preservation. The reality is a human being has a drive to survive, to perpetuate your existence. And that comes from an animal soul, an animal psyche that, again, it's not like, kill someone else or be mean. It's simply, I want to perpetuate my existence. Okay, so that's why it's an animal soul. And that's very important to realize that doesn't mean the animal soul is immoral. The animal soul is amoral. It just wants to survive. Is a zebra, is a lion killing a zebra immoral? No, it's just a brute, expression of its wanting to survive and survival of the fittest. The animal soul is, I want to survive. I want to continue myself. Now, of course, unchecked, that can lead to some pretty bad behavior. You have to be civilized about your need for self-perpetuation. And on the other hand, again, if I get knocked off again, I really, really apologize. I hope it doesn't happen, and this is a brand new frontier for me. But just bear with me. Anyways, the animal soul wants to survive, and therefore you can be angry, you can be boastful, you can be lazy. You can also be very kind because it feels very good and feels like being a good person to give. Charitable giving is actually, it feels good. But that, although it's a very noble thing, it still could come from a more, civilized version of the animal soul. And that's the animal soul. Chapter 2 says the second soul in the second Jewish soul is the godly soul. And he starts off, I'm going to share my screen. I didn't make as many slides as I would like, but I feel it does help to have some sort of, some frame of reference to look at. So for what I have, the chapter 2 starts off the second soul, the godly soul. Incidentally, every word in the Tanya he was a master, besides being a genius scholar, he took 20 years to write it. Every word is really so deliberate. The second soul. Why would you talk first about the animal soul and then talk about the godly soul? Why not talk about, I've got good news and bad news? Why talking about the animal soul, the bad news, quote unquote, first? So the reason he specifically starts off chapter 2, the second soul is the godly soul, is because in the human timeline, you actually, what comes to you first? When your baby's born, it's pure animal soul. The godly soul fuses or gets more at the forefront of your brain or your consciousness, the ability to even access it later on. As a matter of fact, that's exactly by the bar and bat mitzvah. It's not, the bar and bat mitzvah is not necessarily a biological part of the human development. It's a spiritual part of the human development when the second soul fully is accessible. Sorry, someone wants to get on. I'm in trouble. Okay. So thank God there's a lot of interest to Tanya. We have a lot of big class tonight, and someone else is texting to get on. So it's a good thing. I'm just sorry for the interruption. So the second soul comes in the godly soul. All right. Now, it's the godly soul. What is the godly soul all about? How do you know when you're getting a message from your godly soul? So I'm going to start off saying one word would be a very good word. I'm going to type it in actually. Selflessness. The godly soul, one of its nice actions or its most notable feature is it's totally selfless. It's the exact opposite of the animal soul, which is all about selfish or self-perpetuation. The godly soul isn't every soul godly? What do you mean the godly soul? Isn't that like a redundant? The godly soul is, in the words of the Tanya, I'm going to scroll down, is a part of God literally. Now, what does that mean? It's a part of God literally. Isn't everything a part of God? Isn't God invested in all parts of creation? But the Tanya is going to show you from a quote from the Torah, two quotes from the Torah, that although everything is created from God, the godly soul is a part of God literally in the sense that it, just like a part of an apple, a tiny little piece of an apple. It's not the beautiful, big, red, delicious apple, but in that little piece of apple, it has all the DNA and all the features, although very, very tiny, aspects of the apple. So the godly soul has all the aspects of God in a created, albeit spiritual entity. And I'm sorry, someone keeps texting me to give them the Zoom. I apologize for that, so I will just humor them. I'm part of having Ahavat Yisrael tonight. All right, there we go. Hopefully, no more interruptions. So that is the godly soul. It has everything, like a tree is also a part of God, but it's one aspect of God, or it has a much more veiled, it's much more veiled how it's a part or reflection of a godly reality. The godly soul, it's totally aware and open how this is nothing else other than a spark of God. Any questions on that before we go further? On the language? Okay, if there's no questions, I will continue. So we're going to move on to the two explanations of what that means, of that it's that the God. So I gave you an idea that generally it's a part of God, but how do you see that? How do you see that this is a part of God more so than anything else? So it explains. The next one is it says in the verse, when God created man, it said, "Vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim." God blew into God blew into his nostrils a breath of life. So that's very nice, very poetic. Obviously not literal because God doesn't have a big mouth with a lot of breath. But it's figurative speech. The Torah speaks in relatable language, and that's a nice way of explaining to us. But what's it explaining? So you have to pin it up against the language used, how God creates the rest of the creation, the rest of the world. And what is the expression used for how God created light, and God created the oceans, and God created the land? What's the expression? What's the verb used? And God spoke. God spoke, let there be light, and there was light. Let there be a sky, and there was a sky. Let there be dry land, and there was dry land. Again, not literal. The Torah speaks to man, and it speaks in language. It's a very important principle. The Torah speaks in language relatable to man, but obviously it's figurative of a infinite, non-physical, not physical God, or not limited to physical God. And God spoke. What does speech mean? So speech what does that reflect? When you speak, you're actually creating things. You're creating words. You're creating a communication to somebody. You're taking, and what's the mechanics? The creation, the idea, let's say, originally it was in your mind, inside of you. You have a friend, or you have, a whole YouTube channel, let's say, and you want to get your message out, so you speak it. And the speech is reflective of that you're taking something that's inside of you and you're communicating it outside. And God had this idea, let's make a world with people who will have free choice and can be partners with me in making an exquisite masterpiece of a harmonious, beautiful, kind, holy world. And they're going to be real partners because there'll be free choice. So God had this idea, or this actually in Tanya it says, originally there's something before idea, that's desire. He had this desire for that picture world, the picture perfect world of having a world where God's goodness and holiness is brought about through our free choice. And God said, let us make the light, let's make the skies, let's make the animals. And that's speech. So it's a great metaphor for creation. But when it gets to man, God doesn't say, let there be man, and there was man. Like the way the Torah explains that God created the animals was, let there be animals, and then animals were created, body and life force together. Why not? God has the picture in his mind. He has the 3D printer technology to create zebras or bears. So he said, let there be bears, and there was a living bear right away. But when it came to man, there was a two-step process. Number one is God formed man, from the dust. Again, figurative, you could call it from molecular structure. God created the body. And then Tanya quotes the other verse. God breathed a soul into his nostrils. And the Tanya says that part of it refers not to the biological life force, because that, if God just wanted to create a living man, he could have done it like he created a living bear. Just say it. But God did it in a little differently because man is a totally different animal. God created man with a body, possibly with a life force as well. I'm not sure, I didn't look into it, but they could have had the animal soul right away. But then God breathed in, didn't say in, but breathed in breath to give another soul. And that's the godly soul. And what Tanya is pointing out from there is that the metaphor of breath is much more essential than speech to human survival. Today it's very, we see that with the unfortunate cases of the coronavirus, how breath is so precious. And because breath comes from within, the Tanya says. So God, again, figuratively, but it's reflecting a truth, that God breathed in, and a more essential part of God's essence into man. So that's number one. Blowing versus speaking is one aspect of the godly soul, that it's God's breath. It's more essential than any other part of creation. It's more, and that's why it's a part of God, literally. It's more of God's inners coming into a creation. And no other creation has this other than man. The other point that Tanya says is how this soul originates in God's thought. Now, what does it mean that originates in God's thought? So again, by way of analogy, and by the way, the Tanya is very comfortable using the anthropomorphic ideas because the Torah is very clear that man was created in God's image. Not literally. God's not this big, giant in the sky that, Jack and the Beanstalk got to. But the body, the physical body, and the way it functions is reflective of a spiritual truth. And we're going to learn actually in chapter 3, that's called the cosmos are created in something called the 10 Sephiros. And the body is reflective of that. It's the physical incarnate of that. But the body also, just like you have, so we take a lot from the workings of the body, or more particularly the mind, in way of explaining soul and relationship to God. So you have thought and you have speech, thought versus speech. Thought is more, your ideas is more, or out of the entire part of the human personality, we'll actually learn in chapter 3 as well, not thought versus speech, thought versus emotions. That your thought, your thinking, your consciousness is probably the most essential depiction of who you are. Your self-concept, your thinking. And it says that the Tanya brings down how the soul originates in God's thought. Again, it's both bringing out how it's this godly soul is a part of God. Literally, it's the most, in this world, it's the most depictive of God, of God's, it's the most reflective of God. Any questions on that? Okay. So in the practical Tanya, if you have it in front of you, you have some really good practical lessons. I think one thing we get out of there is that your divine soul, the godly soul, the divine soul, is a piece of God literally. Practically speaking, God is more present in your soul than in any other part of the universe, as we gave the two details. And by the way, the fact that it's in God's thought or God's wisdom, well, is that God? Is God's wisdom God? And in the Jewish philosophers have this quandary that if you say God has wisdom, then you're sort of making God into like there's God and his wisdom. That's kind of like, plurality in God's oneness, which is not a Jewish idea. So the way Maimonides explains is that God is unlike humans that we have, there's the knower, there's the stuff that's known, and then there's the vehicle, the mind that knows it. So when you learn something new, you're actually changing, right? When you know something, it's a new piece of information, you changed a little bit. It's a big idea, you changed a lot. If you had a really good self-help book, you change even more. But the ideas change you because it's added on to your being till now. But you can't, so God's knowledge of us or God's wisdom, it can't be knowing new stuff, because then you're saying that God changes, which doesn't work for Judaism. So Maimonides explains that God and his wisdom are one. And a human being can't understand this because we don't, we're not infinite, but God, and therefore when God knows, he knows himself, and by that he knows everything, or knows us and everything. I'm not going to get into that too much. So to conclude there, the Tanya gave two metaphors to illustrate how the divine soul is a literal part of God. It was blown into us from God's innards, and it's derived from God's wisdom, which in God's case is totally one with him. Now, section 2 in the practical Tanya, or in any Tanya, if you don't have the practical one, if you have the lessons in Tanya, it's still the same Hebrew, it's just the way it's translated, is now if every one of us has a godly soul, are we all the same? Are we all equal? Is it the exact same by every single person? Offhand, you would say absolutely. If we're saying it comes from God, actually the way it describes it in the thought analogy, it says it's like a child from a parent. And we're going to talk about that more. I was going to talk about this later, but it brings down that the child comes from the mind of the father. As a total aside, in earlier, from antiquity to the early modern period, it was believed that male seed was physically derived from the cerebral matter of the brain, passing down the spine, exiting through a duct at the spine's base. That was what medicine believed till probably the 1900s. That was rejected, obviously, then. But the Kabbalists did accept it on a spiritual level. That idea of spiritual, and actually Rabbi Shneur Zalman elsewhere in Hasidism, he was ahead of his time. He said that medical biology is not, he said he only accepts it spiritually. And we're going to talk about that more later. But just to mention it now, we'll talk about it later. Okay. But if we're all a child of God, or we all come from God's breath, we all come from God's thought, then probably it's a piece of God, literally. There's different types of God. There's different models. There's different car dealerships for this spark of God. It can't be different. It doesn't make sense. Yet, we do see a difference in people's godly soul. And when I say difference in their godly soul, we mean in people's receptiveness to holiness. As an example, the Tanya says, Moses versus us. Do we have the same godly soul? Well, let's think about that. Moses was the greatest prophet who ever lived. Moses spoke, even compared to other prophets, face to face, or whatever that means, figuratively. But it's a very close way of receiving divine revelation. Moses was the giver of the Torah. The Torah had to go through Moshe. I think we can say that Moshe's godly soul was at a greater level than us. And yet it says every one of us has a godly soul. So how do you reconcile the two truisms? We all have a godly soul, and yet we see there's a hierarchy in souls. There's Moses, there's, Moses' brother Aaron, there's the Jews of that time, and even us compared to that era, spiritually, there seems to be some people that are greater capacity than others for holiness. And I actually want to talk about that for a second, because I was trying to follow the Tanya inside, or at least the outline, but sort of off the outline. The godly soul, as mentioned before, is its most obvious quality is its selflessness. In the sense of, it knows it's nothing other than a spark of God. It knows that's its real reality. And therefore, every time it's in a body forced to be in this world, that's like a real prison for it compared to where it really wants to be, united with its source, with God's source, its source, which is God. The godly soul feels that. It feels that it's part of it. It's obviously in a body. It's obviously here on a mission, but it doesn't like. Would you like being in a mission away from your family for the rest of your life? It might be a very important mission. You think about the great heroes of the Jewish people. Eli Cohen, the spy who in Damascus, going into there. Can you imagine what he felt like away from his family, risking his life in enemy territory? And we know he paid the ultimate price. But imagine being a spy in hostile territory. This is antithesis of what you believe and what you love to be with your family and living a real life in Israel. That's the godly soul. The godly soul, this is anything that experiences here, not anything. Generally, what it experiences here, default, is being wrested away from God. It's a barrier. And therefore, the godly soul longs. It's all about longing. It wants actually to leave itself. It's like the word self-annihilation, which is, wow, that sounds very destructive, but it doesn't have to be destructive. It doesn't want to lead an existence that is not 100% real. And when it is distanced for good reason, we'll talk about the purpose of the godly soul later, but it's still in enemy territory. It's still in a hostile world to godliness. It feels an intense longing to leave it, to go back to the oneness. And in that oneness, it's like a spark that goes into a bonfire. It loses its identity, but it feels actually really true. It's true. It's not lose identity. It actually becomes its real identity. Because if you're a piece of God, you want to feel that and be part of it, not feel autonomous. And therefore, that is very important. I think just like a psychological profile of the godly soul. Selflessness, longing, wanting to always never being comfortable in this world, longing for a higher truth. Okay, but back to the question. So, and that's holiness, that type of selflessness in the terminology. So, some souls are obviously more revealed holy than others. Moses compared to us. And the way that Tanya answers that is it'll give a metaphor. And the metaphor will be a way we're going to understand how, yes, on one hand, we're all the same, our godly soul is all the same in the source. But your soul and your body is not in its source. We're going to learn in Tanya, and it's a very famous thing in Kabbalah and Hasidism, that the soul has different layers. I'll say them quickly. They're the one we're talking, the source is called Yechida. Yechida is the source of the soul that is one with God. It just feels one. And then it comes down to Chaya, which is a transcendent depiction of the soul. But then it comes to the body in Neshama, another word for soul, Ruach, and Nefesh. All synonyms, but they actually depict different action parts, different layers of the soul. And the last three come into the body. So to get from that like source of the soul into our bodies, it goes through a whole process. And in that process, what comes down here might be more revealed by Moshe or a great tzaddik, righteous person, and less revealed are the part of the soul that comes to the body in a regular person. So on one hand, it's true, we're all the same godly soul in its source, in our yechidah, but in our more conscious levels of the soul, because it had to go through a whole downward process, and it actually compares it to pregnancy, we'll see in a moment in the metaphor, there's different, people have different spiritual, holy, receptive capacities. Look at that person. That's a holy person. That's an extremely good person, selfless person. And some people aren't as. But that's down here. Okay, so what's the metaphor it gives? So the metaphor it gives is back to the parent, the father, mother creating a child. And it says that so the seed, or let's say more modern terminology, the genetic code, starts in the parent. The way they explain it there for the different roles of the mother and father, they say the father. And then it comes into the seed. And then when the father and the mother conceive together, have a union and come together, and the mother conceives, and the egg is fertilized. So that genetic code gestates in the womb. And in that 9-month period, a very interesting thing happens. What was originally the genetic code, which we say originates in the brain. Again, it could be spiritual, doesn't have to be physical. But I think even genetics, I'm not a maven. Epigenetics, I'm not exactly sure, but I think there's a lot to even compare to modern understanding of science. But it goes in the womb, and that same genetic code creates an incredibly intricate brain of the child and a heart, and then finally creates less essential parts of the body like toenails. Yet it all comes from the same genetic code. So what's interesting is that the different parts of the body originate in the same genetic code, but through the pregnancy and the gestation, different parts of the body are created. And in that way, it brings down that the toenails of a child are connected by way of the 2 points of connection, 6 degrees of connection, 2 degrees of connection. The toenails, or any part of the body, the toenails just being like the most, external, are connected to the brain, the child's brain. And the child's brain is connected to the parent's brain, right? Children have traits of the parent. And it's most, depicted in the brain. versus in the other parts of the body. You can have, he has his father's ears and his mother's chin, so on and so forth. But so that's the metaphor. And that's, by the way, just as a nice practical lesson, I think it says here, is that why do I feel such a wondrous and powerful unity? You can even learn from the metaphors of Tanya. Why do we feel such a strong connection with our child? Because that child and all of the child, every part of the child, the cheeks and the fingers and the toenails, it all comes from the parents' genetic code, yourself, and that's you. So you love the child, you're loving you. And let's unwrap the metaphor. All souls come from that genetic code of God. We're all a literal part of God. But then it goes through, in Kabbalistic terminology, a pregnancy. And what's that pregnancy? It goes through all the worlds, all the realms of spiritual reality till it comes into the physical body. And even, a soul, even in the physical world, a soul is always a little bit, it's metaphysical. It's like, it's like a twilight zone, so to speak. But before it gets even to being a soul animating the physical body, or the godly soul giving you your empathy and morality or whatever, there's many worlds, spiritual worlds, that it goes through. And I'm not going to get to the names of those worlds, but the idea is that higher worlds is where God's reality is palpable, and any creation there, or any, even, we're talking metaphysical, we're talking angels or the souls in heaven, or it realizes that everything comes from God. That's why it's called, by the way, heaven. It's called the world of truth, because you're just seeing how everything is part of Hashem, everything's part of the plan. But to come into the physical body, it goes through that world, and a lower world, which is a little more veiled, the world of emotions, the world of intellect, the world of emotions, till finally comes into the physical body. So in the metaphor, it's like you have the same genetic code creates a heart, a brain, a liver, and toenails. They're all part of the same body. You need every single part of that, and that's a full human body. So it's not like, well, one is like, an accessory. It's all part of the human body. And they're all interconnected. They're all part of one thing, but they all have different roles, pending, as the genetic code, the seed and the egg gestate and go through the pregnancy. So that's why, answers the original question, why you have some souls that are on a godly souls that are on a lower level. In a sense of lower, it's not as easy for them to be selfless and obviously holy than others. And this, by the way, is a very important concept, not just for me, you, and someone else, of our different spiritual roles. It also is a concept of how we all interact, not just together in this lifetime right now, but how every generation of the Jewish people interacts with previous generations. In the Talmud, it says that the later generations, the ones before Mashiach comes, are called the generations, the souls of Ikvasa de Mashiach, of the heels of Mashiach, literally meaning that the proximity is close to the heels of Mashiach. You hear the footsteps of, of Mashiach. So we're later generations. But the Tanya explains that everything is there's different ways of understanding that. One is that we're like the heels compared to the generation of Moses, which is like the brain. In Moshe's generation, not just Moshe, but all the Jews saw God themselves by Mount Sinai. And they learned Torah directly from God, at least the first 10 commandments, 2 commandments or 10 commandments, whatever. And they all were Moshe's generation, and they were called the Dor Dea, the generation of divine knowledge. I think our generation is not called the generation of divine knowledge. We're called, as the Talmud says, the heel generation, in the sense of spiritually we're on a lower level in our receptiveness to naturally getting holiness, naturally feeling like nothing other than a part of God, or at least realizing that truth. So that is how the Tanya explains that we all have the same godly soul in the source, but as it plays out, like the genetic code is conceived and then gestated until finally different body parts come from the same genetic code, we all, as it plays out here, have different roles in our godly soul, how wholly, easily accessible that hallmark trait of the godly soul of humility and selflessness, and which is what holiness means here. Any questions? I'd love to have some questions before I go on. This, as an aside, this doctrine of Koma Shlema, that the Jewish people were all one big body. And this is why it's okay if you're a toe, soul, so to speak, or a or more internal organ, or the brain, because we're all doing this together. Elsewhere in Tanya, it talks about when you love your fellow, you're literally loving yourself. You're all part of one Koma Shlema, one body, full body. Okay. Now, a lot of times those 2 points, I think that's the main, I think, if you have to walk away from the Tanya of chapter 2, the main point is what the godly soul is. It is selfless. It's a spark. It's a literal part of God, more so than anything else in creation. And it has these traits of, I am nothing other than a spark of God, and therefore I want to connect to my source. And therefore these like irrational or super rational thoughts of doing good or doing things even at your own, against your self-perpetuation, right? You don't care about self-perpetuation. The animal soul is the drive that cares about the self-perpetuation. The godly soul could care less about that. On the contrary, self-perpetuation stops it from connecting to its source, to its Father in heaven. At least, initially. We'll talk later how they both work together and they fuse together. And it spoke about that we all have the godly soul. However, in practical, the way it comes out into our bodies, there will be different levels of the godly soul's ability to flex itself and be totally or less receptive to holiness and God, and totally, self-effacement in the face of God, or in the middle, or less than that. And this is an interesting concept where you don't even have to be aware of this for this to be a reality. Just like the toenail doesn't have to be, it's the most deadened part of the body compared to, the skin or organs or stuff or limbs. You could cut it even, right? It doesn't change the fact that it's getting its nurture from the brain of the child's. The toenails are getting from the brain of the child. And the child's brain is very much reflective of the parent's brain. So even if you don't feel it, or you're the most deadened spiritually, it doesn't change the fact that you're still a godly soul, which is reflective of God more than anything else in this universe. Section 3 mentions a very interesting concept. It's sort of a incidental, but nothing's incidental. It goes on, thing to thing. This is why there's a mitzvah. It says we have a mitzvah in the Torah to attach yourself to God. What does it mean? How do you attach yourself to God? So the Talmud says that you attach yourself, you connect yourself to a sage, a great Torah scholar. Then, or you give kavod, you honor, or you respect a Torah scholar, then you're attaching yourself to the Torah scholar, and that is like you're attaching yourself to God. So some rabbis take that too far. They think they're God, But literally, what it means to say is, we just spoke about. And the metaphor about the godly soul comes in different ways. The souls that are the leaders of the generation, those that are extremely versed in Torah and live by it, and their whole life is all about seeking truth and living truth, and their job is to be the rabbi or the spiritual leader of the generation. When you connect to them, you're connecting to, like in the analogy, it's like the toes connecting to getting nurture from the brain. And the brain is, reflective of the parent's brain. So when a simple person does this mitzvah, it's one of the 613, attach themselves to a scholar, to a spiritual leader, a rabbi, or what they're doing is they're actually connecting to not to the rabbi or the sage, you're connecting to the wisdom of God's presence, or of the Torah, which is connecting to like the toe connecting to the brain, which connects to the original source. And that helps it. And when you do that, it reveals it, it helps reveal how we are connected to God. Just to be clear, when the toe connects to the brain and it's conscious of that connection, then it's a healthy toe. I don't know if it knows it, but if there's no blockage. Human beings have free will. When we know we're connected to God, and we're all part of the one koma shlema, one body. So when any soul, even a lower level receptive holiness soul, it connects to a higher receptive soul, a Torah scholar, or a great, honest, true Jew, leader, then you're connecting to, it's like you're connecting the flow. You're not connecting to the sage. The sage is just reflective, the most, vis-a-vis, a lesser soul's receptivity. You're just showing that how you're connected, in a healthy way, to the God's brain, so to speak, God's wisdom through the scholar. And this is why in Hasidic, this is the source of why we have such a deep connection with the Rebbe. The Rebbe wasn't just a great, nice leader or a caring leader. Spiritually, the Hasidic idea of a Rebbe is all that, but its main function is the head of the Jewish people. It's like Moshe. Look at Moses. Moses had so many great qualities. He was brilliant. He was selfless. He was kind. He risked his life to help others. But Moshe's main essential quality was that he was the head of the Jewish people. He was their way the Jewish people connected through Moshe to God. How? Moshe got the Torah. Moshe was living, breathing the Torah, and he gave that Torah to the Jewish people. And that idea exists in every generation. Every generation has their Moses, that brain, so to speak, the child's brain, which is mirroring the parent's brain, God's brain. This is not physical brain, spiritual mind. Now, that's sort of the source of a Rebbe. So that is that. It mentions one more interesting idea in section 4 of the Practical Tanya, the soul at conception. It seems to be that if we all have this godly soul, then what is a way how some people, what's the luck of the draw? Like some people are like born like a Moses, and other people are born, with a much more of a barrier to spirituality and holiness. So the answer is that's God's plan. What soul comes to which child is God's plan. But in our ability to access our godly soul, some of us have an easier time and some have a harder time. And that, to some degree, the parents, the way they conduct themselves in intercourse, if it's done in a loving, healthy way, and the Torah gives, guidance, a lot of myths out there, but basically if it's done in a healthy, loving union, and of course also the concept where the idea of mikvah is very important. This is, these things help the child that's conceived have easier interface to accessing their godly soul. And because it mentions, as a sort of a side note, Kabbalah talks about the way parents conduct themselves in intercourse, and the way the child's conceived from that intercourse is depicts some, if the child be holy or not, and explains it doesn't change the essential godly soul in every child. It does help in the accessibility to that godly soul. It calls it a garment. That garment comes from the parents' conduct. And that's where, again, the idea of mikvah is very important, and a healthy, loving relationship. Okay, that is a summary of the Tanya. If anybody has any questions, now is the time to talk about it. Anything we talked about, I'd love to hear. Before I call on our most vocal student, Lee, anybody want to share something? Anybody? Lee? Howard, what about you?
I actually, I actually don't have any questions because it's been really interesting, and we had covered this ground, some of this before, and the idea that you were talking about regarding God's breath versus God's word. My only question would be is, there's a lot of talk about the transition from the Chachma Bina Das, and maybe I'm getting ahead of things here, but the idea of having a thought and then speaking it into a real thing. And I was wondering if that has any relation to the idea of God speaking to create certain creatures, but then with people, it's the breath, it's beyond the words. If there's any connection there whatsoever.
I'm not sure. What do you want to know more than we talked about? I'm saying we spoke about the breath is just.
Well, it seems like the breath if we were looking at that not that, well, if you were looking at the model that you have an idea in your mind, and then the idea is spoken, and then the idea is enacted, right? So that progression, so that is a little different from the idea of God breathing and then God speaking. It seems like the speaking part is the more intentional, right?
Oh, I hear you saying. So breathing is just, you're saying as far as intentionality, like breath is like.
Yes, I was just curious if there is any, because it seems to contradict that model, even though I get the idea of, how the God's breath is more direct. But I wonder if you could speak to that.
So I think, so we're going to talk a little bit more about that in chapter 3, as far as like, all that ideas you were talking about. But everything you have to understand, when Torah brings something, or the Tanya brings something, there's, you can look at it in different ways. But what's important in this case is that we're talking about essential here. It's not about deliberate or not, it's about essential. So of course, speech is more deliberate, but what's more essential to your existence? Your breathing or your speaking? So that's what we're saying. Like, in that sense, speaking is it goes through more layers. It's less essential. It's more deliberate, but it's definitely, it's a more filtered version of you. And the breath, maybe not in the sense of, your ideas and your what you stand for being depicted, but it's just a pure depiction of life, of your life. I think that's what it points out there.
Right.
It's not, what you're saying is true, but we're talking about what's more essential. And in this case, we're saying breath is a more essential giving of self. Although you can argue, but that makes sense?
Yeah. But here's a quick other question. You were talking about the godliness, the strength of a person's godly soul is a little bit dependent on the intention of the union of the parents.
Right.
Does that nullify then if the parents, if there's for some reason the child is born of some God forbid, some sort of misfortunate union that would proceed, that would negate that child from ever becoming a tzaddik?
Well, very interesting question. So Rabbi Steinsaltz has a book on the Tanya as well. I utilized some of it for tonight. It's excellent. It's a lot more than it's a lot more reading than than the books I was recommending. But he tells a story of one of the great Hasidic masters, and probably a colleague of the Alter Rebbe, who was a tzaddik. So a tzaddik in the sense this person was a living, breathing, godly soul in action, had no sense of self, which is, a few in a generation. And he was born to very coarse and, peasant parents, right? And he said, and that's the point he's making actually there, is that not necessarily does a very spiritual powerhouse soul have to come to, very holy spiritual parents. Many times it could be like that, but it doesn't necessarily have to happen like that. It could be that sometimes a child that has great spiritual potential is born to very simple, coarse people. And this was the case in this tzaddik, this Hasidic master. He said that had his father gone to mikvah, which is by the way, mikvah for a man is more of a spiritual thing. For women, it's more of a biblical commandment and more essential. But he was saying, I think the story, to be exact, that his father had been a little more spiritual, that his child, this Hasidic master, my life work would have been much easier.
Hmm.
So, what does that mean? It means he was still, obviously was a great person that overcame maybe some hardships internally to reach and express spiritual greatness. The parents would have helped, could have, everything's according to divine plan, but he's saying that as a lesson moving on, that the parents' conduct in the conception of the child does help the child have easier access to their spiritual gifts, the godly soul.
Yeah, interesting.
And that's created, the way Tanya calls it, the Tanya says, the spiritual, the sexual union, the way it's done, it creates garments for the soul. It doesn't create the soul, it creates garments for the soul. Refined garments or less refined garments.
Yeah, thanks.
So yeah, there's a lot of, we'll end off there. As if with everything in Tanya, every chapter, there's the main ideas, and there's so many other things it gets into. By the way, this explained this. By the way, this explains this. Hope you enjoyed tonight's class. I will send out an email with the recording, and I'll try to send it also an email with the links for the reading. But if you want to get a head start, you can read in the Practical Tanya, chapter 3, we're going to do next week. And if you have, you don't have access to the hard copy of the Practical Tanya, on Chabad.org, you type in chapter 3, lessons in Tanya, and you will get it on your screen. Have a wonderful, healthy, safe week.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Rabbi. Beautiful.
Questions, feel free to text me with questions or email with questions if you were on this or on chapter 3. Some people have done that. Thank you to Lee and Howard. You texted me some questions. It helped me formulate what I'm going to focus on more tonight. So keep it up.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I know you should
Beautiful
have.
class.
Very interesting.
Beautiful.
Good night.